Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for the book talk, The Morality of National and Economic Progress. We are Velicham Europe Students Forum, an Indian Muslim student group with members from different European countries. We often hold online sessions like this on topics relevant to the student community and beyond. In the past, we have also organized some workshops and which is career related and education related for the aspiring students in India who are looking forward to studying in Europe. Today, we are coming with a very different session. It's about economics and economic growth, Islam, morality, spanning over these topics. As we know, economic growth, we know about that. We lot studied about and learned about it, about numbers, maybe about GDP, about profits, trade, and everything. But is it really only about numbers? Actually, the economics behind those numbers are there's real questions about people's lives, who benefits and who gets left behind from the so-called progress, economic growth. And most importantly, can economic growth be moral? These questions we have as today, it will be addressed by our very reputed guest, Waseem Naser, Dr. Waseem Naser. He was a German academic exchange fellow, dad fellow in Max Planck Institute, Halle in social anthropology. He did his PhD on the topic or the with the research group, the bureaucratization of Islam and its socio-legal dimensions in Southeast Asia. He also holds a master's degree in economics from IIUM Malaysia, where he wrote on Adam Smith's moral philosophy. His research focuses on intersections of ethics, economy, and society, asking how Adam Smith's ideas can be reread alongside Islamic thought today. And of course, he is the author of the book we are discussing, Adam Smith and Islam, Reconsidering the Moral Foundations of Economics. The book was published just a couple of weeks, just a couple of months ago by Other Press and Islamic Book Trust in Malaysia. On behalf of Velicham Europe, I am using this opportunity to congratulate Waseem on this notable contribution to the world of knowledge. So today or tonight, we are not just talking about markets or money. We are talking about values, justice, and the choices societies make in the name of progress. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Waseem Nasser. The mic is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and Assalamu alaikum to everybody. Before I begin my talk, let me just try to share my screen. Okay, let me begin again by thanking Velicham Europe. Uh, you always, I'm always part of Velicham Europe, having been there for 4 years, and it's also a privilege and an honor for me that I'm giving a talk on this book for the first time with Velicham Europe again. Um, so, at the outset, let me clarify a few things. Um, when Velicham approached me about an idea of giving a book discussion on my book, one of the first questions I asked them was that we cannot have a discussion unless everyone has read the book. And since this book was released 3 weeks ago, not even a month ago, I'm not sure if most of us here have read the book. So what I suggested instead, and what I'll be doing today, is that I'll be giving a very basic impression about the book, which hopefully will motivate you to go and read the book, inshallah. But also, another point to note here is that this book is um, technical in nature, so much so that uh, even advanced students of economics might find a lot of the discussions in the book beyond what is today considered economics, and um, that is one of the main reasons I've written the book. Um, that sadly, a lot of fundamental issues, fundamental aspects, foundational aspects of economics today is unfortunately not discussed or taught in contemporary economic departments. And this book is a means of bringing back those discussions, philosophical discussions, topics of ethics, politics, history, so on and so forth, back to the frame of economics. And um, what I've suggested and what I'll be doing today is that I'll be focusing on one particular element, and that is on history, about how history is very central to economic thought. And at least for Adam Smith, it is one of the main key elements in his understanding of political economy, and how we as Muslim academics, thinkers, have immense potential within our traditions to bring new discussions to economics through the notion of history. So, without further ado, let me begin with a very basic, uh, something very basic, and that is what is economics. So, in theory, usually what we study as economics or what we read as economics is based on this idea that there is this domain within our social life called the economy, um, that um, is something that economists study about. And what we study mainly about is the nature of human exchange. How do humans exchange resources? How do humans exchange, engage in the process of exchange with each other? And these could be questions like um, what motivates people to engage in the process of exchange? How are the process of exchange hindered? What mediums are there? So money is today one of the main mediums of exchange. There are also forms of exchange which involves barter without the use of money. There are other forms of exchange between nations, between societies, between cultures, between traditions. So this is one aspect that is taught in economics. Another aspect that is very central to the discipline is, at least modern economic discipline, is the notion of market mechanism. And this has to do with the laws, so-called laws of supply and demand, that decides the price of a particular object, particular commodity. And then what is studied is what affects the price of a commodity, how is that price determined, uh, how does the law of supply and demand operate in different spheres, in different sectors of the economy. And then finally, from these comes the broader question of how should be a society ordered, how should a nation be ordered, how should global transactions, international transactions be ordered. Here we're talking about social order, and there economics today has taken a central position in contemporary understandings. I don't have to mention that nations today are often classified into developing nations, developed nations. Nations are also classified into capitalist societies, socialist societies, um, so on and so forth. All these are based on economic theories. Now, um, what is economics in practice, or um, what do economists per se do? And here again, the central question is efficient allocation of resources. One of the main element here is how should resources be distributed? What mechanisms of distribution functions in a society or ought to function in a society? The second key element here is how should human choices be regulated? So to give a very basic example, how much taxation should be implemented on a particular commodity so that it is bought more or bought less? This is one basic question. This is again connected to the question of how should resources be allocated. And then finally, emerging from these is visions of property relations and property laws. Um, Here again, economists are very central to how property laws are framed. How should, for example, today, burning question is how should intellectual property be regulated? How should it be legalized? So on and so forth are not just aspects or discussions of law, but it's also very centrally discussions of economics. So this is something that is today considered as economics. Now, what makes this discipline modern? Now, this is something that was with me from the beginning of my education. Are these discussions really modern? And obviously, these are not new questions. Humans have been asking these questions in different ways from the very beginning. How should choices be regulated? How should prices be fixed? How should society be ordered? These are not modern questions. These are not questions that we only started asking after the discipline of economics supposedly came about. Now, that led me to the question that eventually led me to researching on Adam Smith. So, for those of you who are not familiar, Adam Smith is today considered as the father of economics, based on his book, The Wealth of Nations, that was first published in 1776. Now, uh, we are taught, or modern economics uh, courses today teach, that economics as a discipline began with this book. And again, going back again, my question there was, what was what made this book bring about this new discipline? I mean, what changes happened such that this new discipline emerged, something that was not there before? And in my book, uh, this question, what made Adam Smith formulate this new discipline, was also uh, um, brought along with the question that how did this discipline change our society? So these are the two overriding questions that motivated me to research more on Adam Smith and eventually led me to this book. Now, prior to Adam Smith, you definitely see discussions of economics, but they are usually framed within discussions of either ethics or politics. Um, Economics is usually something that comes in between ethics and politics. And this you can see in philosophical discussions, you can see in theological discussions, you can see in legal discussions. And um, in all these discussions, there's always a metaphysical basis that gives rise to these. So there is always, every tradition, every intellectual tradition has a notion of ethics, has a notion of politics. They might not necessarily have a classified sphere or science of economics, but these discussions are always either found in discussions of ethics or in discussions of politics. And when we read these books, well, be it Islamic traditions, be it Indian traditions, be it other non-Western traditions, we find that these discussions usually have to do with aspects of household or aspects of family. So you could see it's something in between ethics and politics. Now, what did Adam Smith do? Adam Smith was someone who formulated this intermediary space into a new science called political economy. But more importantly, what I argue in my book is that what made Smith's project radical was that he was completely anti metaphysical. He was of the opinion that in order to erect a new science, we have to uh, give away with any notions of metaphysical inquiry. Rather, everything should be based on empirical observation or empirical analysis. And that's where he builds his notion of political economy. But What I argue further is that this notion of political economy is one small subset of his larger moral project. So you could see in this diagram, Smith's project was based on beginning from the notion of ethics, which then leads to a larger sphere of political economy, and which then leads to a larger sphere of jurisprudence, and then leads to his overall moral project of natural philosophy. What's very striking here is that there is no politics in his formulation. He combines that intermediary space with politics, but then introduces a new sphere of jurisprudence. This is what made Adam Smith the father of economics as we see it today. And the sphere of political economy is usually discussions that would we would consider today to be those associated with civil society. So now I'll come to these later, but this is basically why Smith is considered as the father of economics, but also why economics seems to be how it is today. We have a lot of changes later on after Smith, but Smith laid the groundwork for how economics as a discipline evolved later on. Now, in my book, I give a discussion of his overall project. As a caveat for those who are going to read this book, there's very little of economics in my book. I engage more with his more larger project, his ethics, his jurisprudence, his politics, more than his economic discussions. The reason being is that this book is a means of bringing those discussions back to economic discussions. So I'm not going to go into the details of these. I'm going to keep it a bit more simpler. I'm going to go directly into his notion of ethics. And here again, Smith was of the opinion that in order to erect a new science, there should be no metaphysical inquiry. Rather, he began his ethics or a science of ethics with this basic questions. How do humans make moral judgments? He was not concerned with the question of why should humans be ethical or why should humans be moral. He considered those kind of questions to be unscientific, or at least science cannot provide an answer to those questions. Rather, what science can give us is analytical solutions or analytical arguments for how humans make moral judgments or humans arrive at moral judgments. And I'm not going to go into the technical aspects of this. I want you to focus on the right side, this progression, which I think is interesting. So Smith considers that humans progress on different ethical planes. In the beginning, just as among children, humans inherently have a tendency or desire to be praised. You can think of children. Children like to be praised. And the virtue of prudence allows us to move to a higher level of ethical capacity where we just don't want to be praised, we want to be honored by others. So it doesn't matter if someone tells us that we are good, we want them to honor us for being good as well. And for Smith, the vast majority of humans are on this ethical sphere or ethical plane. And he then says that there's a higher ethical plane which can be achieved through the virtue of what he calls beneficence. And here, it's no longer our desire to be honored. We are at a state where we just want to be virtuous. It doesn't matter whether others praise us or others honor us for our virtuous acts. We do it for the sake of being virtuous. And this, for Smith, is reserved for a very few set of humans. But nevertheless, Smith is arguing that politicians, statesmen, jurists, and other socially elite humans should aspire to this stage or state of ethical capacity. Now, from his ethics, I'm now moving on to his social understanding. From humans, I'm moving now to the social sphere. And here he says that society progresses through four different stages. And the first stage is that of what he calls hunters. And these stages are based on property relations. In the first stage, it's simple possession. In this stage, there is very little of what we call property. Humans are in at the time. Today, we would not refer to these terms, but they are called as hunter gatherers. Um, and then, when humans start domesticating animals, or when animals start becoming property, society moves to the stage of shepherds or nomads. And here, animals become a key form of property that organizes that society in a different way. And then, when humans start domesticating land, or when land becomes a form of property, there are changes in that society that then creates changes in their ethics, creates changes in their social relationships. And the final stage is when contracts, immaterial contracts, become a form of property. And this is the highest stage that a society can reach, and he calls it the stage of commerce. So when Smith is writing this in the 18th century, he considers Western Europe to have reached the stage of commerce, and he's writing his Wealth of Nations for a society where commercial expansion is occurring at a rapid pace. And you have to remember, by commercial expansion, what I mean is also colonial expansion in the 18th century. And this book is targeting statesmen, politicians, rulers, and lawmakers about how a society ought to be organized, or a commercial society ought to be organized in this rapid expansion of commerce. Now, this is his basic understanding of history, and I'm going to be focusing more on this today because this is something that's much more interesting for a general audience. Now, from this, he develops his economics, and the ethical root of this economics is that he locates this basic desire in every human, that every human desires to better their own condition. And from this desire arises a propensity to exchange. Humans exchange in order to improve their own condition. And this exchange can be through the medium of money, it can be through the medium of other forms of property. Uh, but nevertheless, this desire is something that leads us to exchange with each other in society. And this process of exchange then leads to the process of division of labor. And two different, the higher stages, the division of labor becomes much more complex. So in the stage of hunter-gatherers, one single individual would do for himself a lot of activities that in a agricultural or commercial sphere would be done by 10 or 20 people. Division of labor. So uh, a shoemaker would focus on making shoes for everybody, whereas let's say a barber would focus on uh, cutting the hair off everybody else. He would not engage in the process of making shoes for others. So through this process of division of labor comes the sphere of markets. And it's from this markets that societies gradually emerge to the stage of commercial state. Now, this is the basic ethical root of his economic project. And from this, I'm going to list out a few of the fundamentals of his political economy. The first fundamental tenet, you could say, of his project was that wealth of a nation does not lie in money or gold, but in the quality and division of labor. So he gives a very interesting anecdote here. He says when um, the colonial expansion went to South America, particularly the Portuguese, they were searching for gold in all these lands. And he gives an anecdote of how one of these Portuguese uh, explorers ended up with the Mongols, and for them, the Mongols, they were rather asking these people. So these people were asking the Mongols if they had gold with them, whereas the Mongols were asking them if they had sheep and animals back in Western Europe. So the story behind this anecdote is that for the Mongols, wealth lay in the form of property of animals, whereas for these European explorers, wealth was rather in the form of gold. And for Smith, he's giving the basic key here is that wealth does not lie neither in animals nor in the form of gold, but in the quality of labor and how much the division of labor has occurred in each society. And then he goes on to show why the Portuguese Empire collapsed. Not because they did not have enough gold, but precisely because they had too much gold. And when a society has too much gold, the prices of everything goes up. Um, you have the same resources, but an infinitely higher amount of gold, which leads to an inflation in society and eventual downfall of that society. Rather, what each nation should be focusing on is to improve the quality of its labor and facilitate the increasing division of labor so that specialization keeps occurring. The second key fundamental tenet of his political economy is his distinction between use value and exchange value. And he gives a famous example or comparison between water and diamond. Water is a commodity that has extremely high use value. We cannot live without water, but in most societies, it has very low exchange value. You hardly get anything for exchanging water. On the other hand, diamond is something that has very little use value, but extremely high exchange value. And the reason he gives this distinction is to make the argument again that it's not gold, it's not the price of a commodity that distinction that uh, delineates its value. Rather, again, it's labor that is the source of this value. So, water is something that can be easily procured. It often requires very little labor. On the other hand, there are societies, there are contexts where water is very precious. And here you see that the price of water goes up. Now, diamonds are something that is very hard to obtain. It requires a lot of labor and it requires specialized labor, which is why, again, the diamond has extremely high exchange value. So, this is his second key fundamental tenet. The third important aspect of his political economy is his delineation of how the division of labor occurs, how it can be facilitated, and how through the division of labor, societies can progress to higher stages. And this can be done, according to Smith, by understanding the dynamics between land, labor, and capital. And the factors here is rent, wage, and profit. So for each stage of society, be it agricultural society, be it commercial society, um, you can understand the dynamics of division of labor through these three factors. Now, um, having said these fundamentals, I'm now coming back to the notion of history and how it's very important in his conception. And for Smith, one of his key, you could say, innovations was his idea of history as progressing through unintended consequences. History is taken to be very unintentional. Um, and let me explain that. So, the reason he says that, um, he gives it through very, very convincing examples. So, Smith was writing at a time where, because of colonial expansion or because of colonial uh, conflicts, nations were engaged very aggressively in the uh, practice of trade. Trade was seen as where there is always one winner and one loser. This can be between two individuals, this can be between two nations. Rather, Smith is trying to show that more often than not, trade is something where both parties end up with a positive net. And I'll explain this later, but he is trying to show that wealth is something that humans can create through the practice of trade. And here, his notion of unintended consequences is very important. Um, Second thing, um, and this is something that is targeted to policymakers, statesmen, is that markets is often left uh, better left to its own forces. That supply and demand is the best measure of how a price of a commodity is regulated. And more often than not, regulating a price beyond these factors of supply and demand often hinders the production and consumption of commodity. And here he is going against this policy of mercantilism during his time, where based on this idea that trade is something where someone loses all the time, nations were engaged in aggressively uh, producing and consuming commodities for their own. So, to give an example, he gives this example where England during his time was very efficient in producing wool and leather, whereas France was very efficient in producing wine. Now, it would be detrimental for England to produce its own wine due to climatic factors, due to geographical factors. And similarly, it would be very detrimental for France to engage in the production of wool and leather. What is beneficial for both these nations is to engage in trade so that France can get better quality leather and wool, and England can get better quality wine. And he, through this example, he's trying to show that both parties end up better off if they focus on their own strengths rather than trying to produce their own commodities themselves. This is also a point to show that England should not um, interfere in the prices of wine, and France should not interfere in the prices of wool and leather. Now, from this, he comes to the point that commerce or the practice of commerce can be civilizing, and it can be a means of alleviating war and colonial conflict. Again, this is something very much to his context. England and France, for example, Portugal and Spain, uh, these nations do not have to engage in war in order to accumulate resources. Rather, they can engage in the very civilized form of commerce, which is ultimately beneficial for all these nations. And the underlying moral project for Smith is that all these key fundamental tenets and these principles lead to the eventual progress of human liberty. This civilizing process, Smith argues, will eventually lead to greater liberty in society. Now, I'm going to focus on this notion of liberty by linking it to the notion of civil society. Um, so, Smith sees this civil society as something between the individual and the state. Um, and like I said before, commerce is one of the main ways through this sphere that civilizes a society. Now, in what's different in how Smith argues is that he is arguing against two other philosophical or very central traditions during his time. One is Republican tradition, and the second one is the Christian tradition. So, in the Republican tradition, the ultimate objective is citizenship. Humans are supposed to be good citizens, and which would lead to better social cohesion. In Christianity, it's redemption in the afterlife, just like in Islam. Uh, but for Smith, like he argues, it's for the progress of liberty in society. Now, the perceptions of trade is also different in these traditions. For the Republican tradition, engaging in trade is a form of corruption. It leads to a lowering of one's ethics. In Christianity, in the broader forms of Christianity, trade is often seen as a lure to sin, where people engage in usurious practices, where they engage in theft, where they engage in other forms of sin. Whereas in Smith's jurisprudence tradition, commerce or trading is seen as something that is linked to freedom and that is linked to a very egalitarian notion of humanity. And but the most key element that separates Smith from these two traditions is the perception of wealth. Both the Republican tradition and the Christian tradition during his time considered wealth to be static, whereas for Smith and for the jurisprudence tradition, like I argued before, wealth is something that can be created because wealth is not quantified through gold or other forms of uh, quantitative currency. Rather, wealth is linked to the dynamics of labor and the creativity of labor. And in this sense, wealth is something that is very dynamic. So, in uh, commercial practices, wealth is more often created when humans engage in exchange. Now, having said all this, Smith is also one of the first critiques of commercial society, and this is something that often goes unsaid. Um, Smith has very critical understandings of how commercial society underpins human ethics. He says that in commercial societies, there is a tendency for duplicity. And what he means is that humans tend to be concerned about what others think rather than what we think about ourselves. And this leads to excessive vanity. We are more prone to projecting what others would like to see in us. And this is something that's very familiar to us today. Another very interesting critique he has of commercial society is that the vast majority of humans in these societies tend to be very submissive because division of labor is very complex. Now, what he means is that the vast majority of humans tend to be focused on doing one or very few particular laboring activities. And this stultifies their intellectual growth. And it doesn't just lead to ignorance, but it also leads to submissiveness, where humans can be easily manipulated. And then finally, he also explains the problem of anxiety. And this is connected to the first one, where given that most of humans in these commercial societies are concerned about what others think, there's also an empowering feeling of anxiety about what others would potentially think of us. So this is so if when people say that Smith is the father of economics, he was also the first critique of commercial society as well. Now, in my project, I begin from this phase to engage with topics that is often considered to be outside economics. And by this, the first element I deal with is his notion of language. The second element I deal with is his notion of cosmology or scientific outlook. What constitutes a science? The third, uh, the third element I deal with is his ethics. And then I look at his politics, and then finally I look at his history. And I'm not going to go too deep now. I've already taken a lot of my time. So I'm going to focus on the final aspect of history. Um, so when you look at Smith's broader works, not just the Wealth of Nations, his other works, Smith makes a very interesting claim that the progression of Western Europe, which we today consider or are taught generally that Western Europe has progressed far beyond most of the other societies. Smith actually makes the claim that this progression is very unnatural, and this is linked to his historical outlook. So he gives this narrative that subsequent to the fall of Roman Empire, Western Europe became a conglomeration or collection of feudal lands, where lands were controlled by despots who controlled the people in their lands. Now, the progression to the commercial stage in the early 14th and 15th century was unnatural because it did not follow the pattern of moving from shepherding stage to the agricultural stage to the commercial stage. Rather, Western Europe jumped from the shepherding stage directly to the commercial stage. And then after this commercial stage was when agriculture started developing in these Western societies. And this, he said, has impacted how um, their division of labor and how their politics has progressed. And I'm going to I'll explain that a bit later. For in this narrative, he gives a very interesting take on the notion of luxury. So in his ethical theory, obviously luxury is something that is frowned upon. But he makes the interesting case that it was luxury that ultimately led to the growth of liberty in these societies. So coming back to the feudal setup of Europe, um, these feudal lands were controlled by people who are often more powerful than the kings. Now, the kings started providing independence to certain cities like Geneva, like London, like Amsterdam, like Lisbon, where trade and commerce progressed. Now, in these cities that engaged with Asia, that engaged with America, that brought in new luxurious items like tea, like antique items like cotton, all these luxury items were brought by these feudal lords. And a lot of their wealth were exchanged for these luxuries coming from the cities. And these feudal lords spent their wealth on these luxuries that eventually led to their downfall. And by their downfall, the kings became more powerful. The kings provided more freedom in the cities. The cities progressed by bringing new laws that were much more egalitarian, much more equal, and this then spread to the feudal lands. So, this is why Smith was saying through this development, agriculture was something that did not succeed or precede commercial expansion. After commercial expansion was when Western Europe started um developing their agricultural lands. But the key point here is that how Smith shows that luxury was how um, the powerful despots in these feudal lands fell and how a new cycle of power emerged. Now, he also deliberates on his contemporary 18th century Britain as well. And his Wealth of Nations is actually a very strong attack on um, the British setup during his time, this very republican tradition that controlled politics and economics of his time. And he calls it the form of mercantilism, where it's aggressive uh, engagement with other nations. But also, in very key uh, an interesting thing for us today is that he shows how the parliament that is supposed to be the bulwark of a society, that is supposed to protect the society, was actually engaged in monopolizing for their own benefit. And to explain this, let me just give you a brief understanding of how the parliament was. The parliament was a representative of the landed elites of Britain, and these people were in charge with setting the laws of the nation. But what these people actually did in these parliaments was to engage in the practice of commerce, and they were, during the 18th century, engaged in the process of making laws that were of benefit to their own trading practices rather than to the general public. And this was very evident in the fact of public stocks. This is public stocks is something that emerged in the 17th century Britain, where the government or the king started selling bonds to the parliament and to the public to raise money for war with France and for commercial expansion in British India. Now, the parliamentarians, as holders of these public stocks, were using these stocks to pressure the king to introduce laws and regulations that would benefit their own trading practices. And the reason I'm saying this is something that we see again today in today's politics and economics, where the powerful elite engages in political, legal, and jurisprudential activities for the benefit of their own economic expansion. And Smith was writing The Wealth of Nations as an attack on this practice, where he was saying, in this context, that markets should be left to their own. Supply and demand should decide on the price of a commodity rather than parliamentarian regulations. But Smith also has very interesting understanding and narratives of why England, among the Western nations, would nevertheless progress further because of its particular common law system. But I'm not going to go deep into that. Now, I'm coming to the final part um, of my talk here. In my chapter on history, I engage with these kind of narratives in Smith and these kind of historical deliberations. Remember, these historical deliberations is not something that we today consider as history. We might think of history today as dates, events, so on and so forth. But this is a different understanding of history, where history is a form of understanding the progress of society, how societies progress. And for Smith, it is something that is very linear. Societies progress from one stage to the next until it reaches the stage of commerce. Now, in the Islamic traditions, uh, the first and the most powerful example we have of this kind of historical deliberation is Ibn Khaldun. And I engage with Ibn Khaldun's ideas in this chapter. I show that Ibn Khaldun has a far more political understanding of history. In Smith, politics is something that is missing. But in Ibn Khaldun, politics is very central to his understanding of historical progression. And it's very, I guess it's well known that unlike Smith's linear progression, for Ibn Khaldun, society moves in cycles. So there is formation, consolidation, and decline. And then again, a society moves through this cycle. And this cycle is predicated on understanding how the dawla or the state is formed, is consolidated, and declines through his notion of asabiya or social cohesion. But I also make a critique of Ibn Khaldun in that when uh, compared to Adam Smith, Ibn Khaldun does not engage in an analysis of this epistemic scheme. For Ibn Khaldun, this cyclical notion is based on the Aristotelian metaphysics, and he does not engage in inquiring about the epistemic worth of this cyclical nature. And I argue that Al-Biruni is someone who is much more interesting in that regard, and is someone who has been very rarely dealt with in our historical traditions. I show that Ibn Khaldun, Al-Biruni has very interesting ideas of how time moves about, how time progresses. He also has very interesting understandings of space, geology, geography, and how that ties to human cultures. And also, furthermore, that Al-Biruni also engages in trans cultural or trans traditional engagements, where his very famous Kitab al Hind engages in this form of uh, cultural translation between the Islamic and Indian traditions. I also look at Shah Waliullah's notion of irtifaq, something that can be claimed to be his original contribution, even though much of what Shah Waliullah argues is based on his reading of Ibn Khaldun. Nevertheless, Shah Waliullah develops a very scriptural argument for his notion of irtifaq, which could also be very potentially useful for um, Muslim economists and thinkers. I then look at more contemporary thinkers like Malik bin Nabi and Ali Shariati, and I show the decolonial possibilities in their thinking. And with Ali Shariati, I show also how there is a revolutionary zeal to his theorizing. With Malik bin Nabi, I show how there is an interesting psychological aspect that can be developed for economic thought. And then finally, I don't show, but I point to the potential of Maqasid al-Sharia for a very jurisprudential understanding of the domain of economy in society. So this is but one example, one chapter of how I engage with Adam Smith's ideas, how I try to link it to Islamic traditions, and by linking it, how I'm trying to rejuvenate the discipline of Islamic economics, which for me at least has reached a stage where there is very little development, and um, my book is a form of rejuvenating these debates. Thank you very much, and I look forward to a discussion. Jazakallah khair.